Welcome to Ollie's Authors Out Loud, a series of discussions with authors exploring their books, delving into the inspirations for their characters, themes, and stories, as well as discussing the craft of writing itself, the trials and victories authors experience seeing their work to completion. I am Jean Greenlaw with my co-host, Susan Supak. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Kate Quinn, a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author. She has had a Reese's Book Club pick and is a Library Reads Hall of Fame author. Kate is widely acclaimed as an author of historical fiction, ranging from settings in ancient Rome to World War II and Washington, D.C. in the 1950s. In anticipation of her latest book, Kate appeared on numerous webinars in the fall of 2025, and the book was named by Goodreads as one of the top 4 most anticipated books of 2026. Kate toured both the United States and Canada when the book appeared and was a keynote speaker at the Texas Library Association meeting in March. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a great event in Texas, and I'm glad to be back virtually.
Good. Now, your latest book, The Astral Library, diverges from your usual genre of historical fiction. What led you to write a book of magical realism, and what is magical realism?
I think magical realism is a bit of a misnomer. It can be, I'm not sure if I have a better term for it. I mean, this is, I think, maybe more fantasy than anything else, although it is not what you might call high fantasy with, a strange continent requiring a very complicated map at the beginning and then a glossary with a new language in it at the end. This was a book that I wanted to write because it came about at the end of the pandemic and lockdown, mid 2021. And escapism was very much on my mind, and indeed probably on most of our minds if we had spent the last 18 months more or less immured mostly at home. Certainly, the only escaping I had been doing with this in that time was within the pages of a book. And so one afternoon when I was walking the dogs, I just had it float into my head, the question, what if you could walk into the world of a novel and live there? Literally live there. And I couldn't quite let that idea go. I thought it was wonderful. And, so I floated it to my editor and my agent. And, I thought 50-50 shot they would just shoot it down, because, it's very much out of my usual lane of historical fiction. But, maybe they were thinking about escapism too, because they said, okay, it's different for you. It's really different, but let's go with it. Let's have fun with it. So I got the green light.
Well, that's wonderful. I looked up the meaning of astral, and the second definition seems to fit your book, relating to a supposed non physical realm of existence to which various psychic and paranormal phenomena are ascribed. Does this kind of fit the meaning and setting you were creating?
More or less, yes. The odd thing about the title for this book is that it came before the idea did, which is very much not how I usually do things. Usually I, get the book idea first and then the title will come along at some point during the writing, or maybe even after it's done if I've just been working under a working title. But with this one, there was already the phrase like the Astral Library just sort of floating around when I've been, throwing fun phrases around with my librarian mother, and we both agreed that was a great phrase. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a book that went with it? Well, eventually, I eventually got the book that went with it.
Well, you chose the Boston Public Library as your setting for your magical library. Why?
Because I spent a lot of time there, and I really do think it's one of the most beautiful book spaces you are ever going to find. I was a college student at Boston University for two degrees, so I lived in Boston for about 7 years, and during that time, being a broke college student, I couldn't really afford to buy that many books, and I certainly didn't have much room for them. So a library card was very important for my reading sanity. So I had a trip to the library at least once a week. And when I found out just really how beautiful the reading room was, that was what made me think, I spent a lot of time reading there and writing, and I loved it. The reading room at the Boston Public Library is really just one of the most liminally beautiful spaces I've ever been in. And I spent a lot of time with my laptop there writing and some time reading as well. It's this long room with this barrel vaulted ceiling and these long windows and these rows and rows of books and these fantastic fireplaces and marble busts and these long tables where there are these green lamps that look like fireflies. And anyone who wants to can come in and work and read as long as they want. And it's got this hush that is just magical. And so when I started to think about a magical library, which is what the Astral Library is, I thought, well, I think it looks like whatever your idea of a dream library looks like, whoever you are. And so for me, that meant it looked like the reading room at the BPL. So that's what told me, all right, I think the character is going to have to be a Boston girl, because if the BPL is her magic library and that's what it looks like to her, then that's where she got it from.
Mm. Libraries are just so important. I would imagine you had fun creating both the setting and the characters. Um, in addition to books or as places to hide patrons, you added paintings and games. This gives more depth. And did you have characters from real life who told you, who made you relate to these realms?
Well, it's one of those things I started to think about, not only books, but story. What are stories and what are the vehicles for stories? And, really, when you think about it, paintings, artwork is absolutely a vehicle for story. Every painting tells a story, even if it is only the story of an emotion, or an abstract feeling, and games are certainly wonderful for story as well. I mean, I am not a gamer, but my husband does, and I have seen him game and heard him rave about his favorite games, over the years. And I know, and through him, I've come to realize that, games have gotten a lot more sophisticated since the days of, when it's just Pac-Man eating cherries, that kind of thing. The best games have very intricate storytelling, and so I ended up thinking, well, if there is a magic library where lost and desperate bookworms can escape into their favorite books and lead new lives, why wouldn't an art lover be able to escape into the world of a favorite painting and live a new life there? Why wouldn't a gamer be able to escape into the world of their favorite game and be able to live there? So it just enabled me to enabled me to enlarge these worlds and make it into something a little more complex and interesting.
Wait, you included so many references that I love as someone who loves libraries. The sliding ladders. I would love to have a house where I had a library with sliding ladders. I have a library, but not tall enough to have
Oh,
sliding
so would
ladders.
I. I mean, I think all bookworms are in love with the sliding ladder idea.
Right.
We all have seen that scene where Belle goes sliding down the length of the bookshop
Yes.
on the ladder. There is no keeping any bookworm off a ladder. Like, it doesn't matter if there's a sign there that says, don't get on the ladder. We're getting on the ladder.
Getting on the ladder. Right. Do with me as you wish, but I'm getting on that ladder. You mentioned the character of Belle, and I must admit that she's my favorite character of all of the Disney movies. I can watch that scene over and over. I rewind it and watch it, the dance of Belle with the monster. Oh, it's so glorious.
Well,
Um,
I think every bookworm, she's your favorite Disney princess. I mean,
yeah.
I think all of us would be willing to forgive the beast, the kidnapping, the extortion, the threats, because if he really gave us that library. I mean, he gave her a library.
Right.
That's going to excuse a man a lot.
Who cares about flowers or candy? Give me a library.
Absolutely.
Now, I would be a ghost in your library, desperately trying to finish my TBR stack and really happy that it never happens. So, how did the ghost come to you?
Oh, it's just a fun detail that occurred to me while I was, sort of fleshing out the library and what its world was and what it looked like. And I ended up thinking, well, I like the idea of a library being haunted, not by mean ghosts, but by or angry ghosts, but by friendly ones. A little friendly haunting is kind of a nice detail. So then it was, what kind of ghost would live in a library? And then it just clicked that, yes, this magic library is absolutely going to be home to those lost souls who do not feel that they can pass over into the great beyond until they have finished all the books that they never had a chance to finish when they were alive. And so you have any number of ghosts in the Astral Library who, and you know, one who's been working on War and Peace for 50 years, and he's going to be there for a while yet.
Right. The librarian with a capital L is, for me, the main character in the book. And I know every reader has their main character. And she's a powerful force who cares desperately for her patrons. And all of them are seeking sanctuary. Can you talk about the how she helps them choose a book in public domain so they become a minor character?
Yes, the rules for the library, which she enforces, are that the library will allow you to escape into a book, and you are allowed to live in that book, live in that book and make a life for yourself. The rules being that it must be a book in the public domain, and that's because if you're not allowed to quote from a book, why would you be allowed to live in it without permission? And so it has to be a public domain book. The other rule is that you do not get to be a named character in the book. Like, you don't get to go to Pride and Prejudice and be Elizabeth Bennet. You're going to be one of Elizabeth Bennet's unnamed neighbors who is at the same parties and living your life while Elizabeth Bennet is living hers. Similarly, you don't get to change the plot of the book. You don't get to bump Elizabeth Bennet out of the way and you get to marry Mr. Darcy instead. So you get to interact with that world and live in that world, but not change it necessarily. And you'll go through the events of the book, but then the book world will continue, as it does, and then your life can continue along with it. Except at that point, you don't know what the plot is anymore. So things can change, and you have to keep in mind how dangerous is the world that you've chosen to live in, because you're not living, if you're living in the world of Pride and Prejudice, you're not living in real Regency England. You're living in the version of Regency England that exists in Jane Austen's mind as she wrote this book. So think about how the writers create the rules for the worlds that they write. If you're going to go to, the world of Game of Thrones, it's not a public domain, but if you were to go there, that's a world with a lot of violence in it. You got to keep that in mind. On the other hand, if you go to a world like Pride and Prejudice, you know that the odds of getting stabbed and horribly killed in a Jane Austen novel is much, much, much lower than it is if you're going to a world made and written by George R. R. Martin. So these are some of the rules for being able to choose your book, and people can find a favorite book and make a new life for themselves within it. And the librarian's job is to protect the library and to shelter the patrons and to give them as much aid and assistance as they need in helping to choose a book, get outfitted for that book, and then ushered into that new world. And she will perform checks periodically to make sure that you want to continue to check out your book and your life along with it, and if that's a good fit. And her job as well is to protect the library and to protect the patrons. And that was, something I really wanted for the librarian when I was creating her as a character, because I knew a magic library would need a magic guardian. And so the librarian, capital L. And when you first look at her, she absolutely is every librarian cliche you can imagine. She's got the bun, the glasses, the sensible shoes, the cardigan, the glare, and she's acerbic and full of information and someone who seems to know everything. And all of that is the surface, but on the other hand, she has hidden depths. And I wanted to, I love the idea always of making it not always be the young characters who get the big battle or the heroic fight or the moment. I like giving, especially an older woman, that badass quality. And so you will find out that the librarian, who is very ageless and very old indeed, absolutely is not someone you want to challenge to a fight.
Well, you mentioned a little bit earlier that your mother's a librarian. Is this kind of a doppelganger of your mother?
She's got a bit of my mother in her as well. My mother was a librarian her whole career. She's retired now, and she is wonderfully acerbic, and definitely was a great resource for me when I was creating this library world. Because I have spent my whole life running around stacks behind her. I was a library kid, and I also watched things. Like watched her come home. Sort of breathing smoke after yet another meeting with library management where somebody is proposing in all earnestness that really a library of the future should only be 1/3 books, and wondering where on earth these people come up with these things. So a lot of this, as I'm creating the bureaucracy around the library, or what are the special touches, in the library, like what does a magical library card do? She would be there saying, "It's like, no, you can make it more boring. You can make the library management worse. I mean, you can dial it up," and I was always dialing it up.
Well, sanctuary is a main theme in the book. Uh, why is this important? And Alex, the other main character, is a former foster child for whom life has never been kind. The library has chosen her, which is a revelation to her. What is the difference between being chosen and choosing?
Well, for Alex, she ended up in the foster care system when her mother ran off with a boyfriend and left her kid behind, and was never adopted by anyone in particular. And that really has, damaged her in some ways, because there's the sensation of, we all would like to be chosen, and we all deserve to be, at least on some levels. I mean, every child deserves to have the security of knowing that their parent would choose them over anything else. That's a parent's job. And yet Alex's, family failed her at that very basic level. And, no adult really showed up for her either. She's shuffled around a variety of foster homes in which she is mostly a burden, mostly ignored, and she was never chosen by a family who picked her for their own. And that is the kind of thing it's difficult to grow up with. And so that's one of the things that she yearns for when she reads, is because as a reader, especially a reader of fantasy, which is fantasy is her favorite genre, characters in a fantasy novel are chosen ones. There's a reason there's the term for it, and it's because the door of Narnia opens for the hero. The the invitation letter to Breakbills University, the Magic University, that comes for the hero and the heroine. The tornado that carries Dorothy to Oz. The magic carpet. Anything that signals, like you're about to go on an adventure, it chooses the main character. And so Alex reads these books just yearning to be chosen, like for adventure, for a little bit of good luck, for love, for family, for something. And so for her, when the door of the Astral Library opens, it is a lifelong dream, and it is the filling of a very deep well of need in her, which is that something finally picked her, and that she wants and she's all in for that. The minute she sees that, it's like, all right, I'm going to go live in my favorite book. I'm not looking back. I have nothing to look back for, but I now have this.
It is so much fun hearing you talk. It's as much fun hearing you speak about your books as it is reading your books. So thank you for that. We had, as you mentioned before, Jean, we had the honor of having you here in Texas. And I know you've been on a tour with the new book, Astral Library, all around the United States and in Canada. So have you had any memories, or did you meet any people along the way that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I met so many wonderful people. I had so many great readers. I felt very privileged at the time to be able to go to Minneapolis, because at the time, Minnesota was very much in the news for their courage in resistance and protecting their citizens against ICE raids. And I thought it was a great privilege to be able to address them and to tell them, keep up the good fight, and we're all watching and we're all proud of you. I loved being able to kick off my tour in Boston. Since this book is set in Boston, I did go on the day before my launch to the reading room at the public library, just sort of stood in there and thanked it, for everything that it's given me. I loved being able to kick the tour off there. That really did feel special. I had a great event the night before with a small group of readers, and we had like Astral Library themed cocktails and snacks and all kinds of things. That was a lot of fun. And then it was great to go to Canada as well. I went all across Canada. I got outside of Toronto. I got to Prince Edward Island, which I've always wanted to see. Since I'm a big Anne of Green Gables fan, that's one of the books that's mentioned as a public domain escape novel in the Astral Library. So yeah, I was very, very, very privileged to be able to hit so many places on my tour and meet so many great readers.
That's great. Your recent book carries a message about the current madness of book banning and the lack of support for, unfortunately, for libraries in some area. And the library board, that's a pretty negative character in the Astral Library. What kind of feedback did you receive about this on your tour and through social media?
Well, my tour was very positive. I mean, like I really did not met nobody but lovely readers who seemed to enjoy it. I know some people weren't as big of a fan. I don't know. I don't think I'm saying anything terribly controversial in saying that book banning is bad and library doors should stay open. Apparently, some people do find this controversial. You do you. I am going to keep on insisting that book bans are bad and that we should leave the curating of libraries to librarians who are in fact trained for it, and we should fight to keep our libraries funded. I mean, libraries exist in a kind of a difficult place. They always have, because they're not businesses, they're not run like businesses, and they are not going to make a profit, and yet they are constantly worried about money and funding. And the funding can often be in the hands of people who have agendas, and sometimes those agendas are very well-meaning, and they're designed to, make the library into a hub and a sanctuary for the community with community resources for people. But sometimes those agendas are not quite so benevolent. And so I decided to, since I know very well as a librarian's daughter how every library struggles with budget cuts and staff cuts and resource cuts. These things are endemic, and everyone, there's a lot of bureaucracy that goes into the running of a library as well. Well, I find it can be both very funny but also very on the nose. It's to think that bureaucracy can be a force for evil as well as a force for truly eye-rolling boredom. And I thought, well, I think I want to explore that and be able to show how even a magic library is not immune to budget cuts and board meetings and people with agendas.
Nobody's safe.
Nobody's safe. Even in a magic library, you have to go to meetings that could have been emails.
Yeah. Well, it's, as I mentioned, the social media can have such a great effect, both positive and negative. And at times, criticism can help create a buzz and popularize a novel. And at other times, it can turn a bit ugly, as posts and bloggers are apt to do. I believe the term is called review bombing. Ugh. And while some of the comments may be legit, the explosive way they're expressed can pile on negativity to such an exaggerated and unfair level that it can really discourage new authors, just as it can help popularize them. Have you ever had any experiences like this in your writing career? Based on that, what advice would you give to the new writers?
I think I've been lucky enough that I've not been, I don't think I've ever had any kind of online mob come out and really pile onto me or any of my books, for which I'm very grateful. But I also believe very strictly that writers should not go looking for these things. And for one thing, I know it's easy to say don't read your reviews. We all want to scratch that itch sometimes, but I've gotten much better about just not doing it. And the reason for that being is that, for one thing, writers being the way that they are, a single bad review can get in your head and echo around in there. Like, you can read 99 good ones and the one bad one will be the one that sticks. And that's not a good thing to invite into your headspace, because after all, there's nothing more you can do about the book now. I mean, it's written, it's done, it's out there. You can't take that feedback and change the book and reissue it. That's not really doesn't really work that way. And the other thing is that reviews really aren't for writers. Reviews are for other readers. And so it's better, I think, if writers stay out of that space, because readers can feel a little self-conscious if you feel like a writer is looking over your shoulder and looking at what you're reading. And reviews really are for, writers need them, because the more reviews there are of a book, the more buzz there is, the more people will have eyes on it, and people can't read something they don't know is there. So we need reviews, but it's better not to go looking for them, because really reviews are for other readers, so that readers can discuss the book, readers can debate a book, trade opinions about it. And that's what readers are for. I mean, we write a book and it's the book of our heart and we love it and we send it out into the world. But once you send a book out into the world, in a sense, it's also no longer yours. Every reader who comes to it is going to have a different relationship with it. And that is something I kind of get into in Astral Library too. I mean, because every reader, who goes into a novel to create a new life for themselves, each one of those worlds is going to look a little bit different because each reader brings something different to the reading of the novel. I think that's one reason why it's valuable to reread things that you've loved, because something that struck you a certain way when you're young might strike you entirely different if you read it 20 years later. And because you're a different person, you're bringing something new to it. It's like the way that teenagers think Romeo and Juliet is so romantic, and then if you read it in your 30s, you're like, oh, kids, please pump the brakes, slow down. Nobody has to die here, and you're all dead. So every reader brings something different to a book, and every reader's relationship with a book is their own, and it's valid. And so therefore, I don't look for reviews. I don't go and try to find them. I certainly don't read my bad ones. I don't need that. And every reader has the right to think whatever they want about a book and to review it however they want. That's their right. And all I ask is, well, thank you for reading. I'm glad you gave it a chance.
Let's segue to your historical fiction books and your method of writing. You are an absolute master of characterization. Your people bounce off the page. For example, for me in The Huntress, Nina just explodes off the page. She just fascinates me no end. And in the Briar Club, this one just took me away. You begin with a cat house as a character, which I think was absolutely brilliant. And as the book progresses, it seems like a carousel to me. Here's the carousel, and a character, it turns, and a character steps off. And we get her backstory. We've seen a little bit about her, but we get to know her. And once we get to know her, she steps back on the carousel and it turns. And the next person steps off the carousel. And as this goes through your book, we begin to see how all these people are interwoven in the whole story, not just their lives, but how their lives fit into these other people's lives. I've never seen that in a book before. It was just wonderful. It was just wonderful. Do you develop each character before you write the book, or do they develop as you write the book?
A bit of both. I always spend a certain number of months before I start drafting a book just doing a lot of outlining, doing a lot of the deep research at that point. And I do a lot of character work. I try to get to know my characters as deeply as I can. I want to figure out, what are their talents? What are their strengths? What are their flaws and their weaknesses? What's their background, their relationship with their family, their education level? What do they say if they drop a brick on their foot? Are they the kind of person who swears, the kind of person who would never swear? Uh, what are the things they love? What are the things they hate? What's that wound that wakes them in the night, or the ghost, that kind of haunts them? These are all things I really like to know before I start writing, and I try to do that as much as I can. But also, the characters will continue to change on me as I'm writing, and sometimes they will surprise me. So I might think, I thought that this character had this particular wound, but actually, that is not the main thing that is troubling her. It's this instead. And that's something maybe I won't learn until I've written a draft and then, gotten to know her even better. So I do a lot of character work in advance, and I really do enjoy that.
The dynamics of female relationships play a large part in your books, and your female characters often display loyalty and empowerment through their friendships with each other. Coming from diverse backgrounds and despite societal constraints, they band together to support and inspire one another. And those same societal pressures have also been known to manifest in a different version. In contrast to the direct competition that men sometimes display toward each other, females can portray a more indirect version of competition with each other, one that manifests itself in forms of rivalry that have been described as catty behavior, even though I don't like that term, gossip, or maybe passive aggressive comments. Can you explain or discuss the dynamics of female relationships and how you choose to portray them in the dynamics of your novels?
Female friendship is really one of the things that, I always like to pay homage to in my books because, it's had a huge role in my life. I have so many wonderful friends in the author world and, also outside of it too, but especially in the writing world. And, these are friends without whom I would, be in a padded room somewhere if I didn't have them in my life. And, they have absolutely talked me off ledges when I am in a bad place, with a book or with something in life. And I've done the same for them. And it is a wonderful privilege. I do think that female friendships have a lot of complexity. I mean, there can be the fact that, there can be spiky qualities about the friendship too. It's not always easy. I don't want to, just do the rah-rah sisterhood sort of thing because that is reductive. But on the other hand, it's equally reductive to go the other way and say that women can't be friends. They're just because they're just catty and cat fighting each other. And because that's not true either. I have found the most wonderful support from the women in my life and my career. And I've done the same supporting them, and I've been glad to do it. I am equally fascinated by found family as a trope. It's one of my very favorites, and it makes its way into almost all my books. And it's the idea, really, that people don't need to be related by blood to form familial bonds. And the thing I like about those is that, like a regular family, sometimes those bonds can be tricky. They can be spiky. They can have their resentments in them. I mean, just the way we fight with our own family, we can fight with our found family too. And so I always want to make sure that the friendships between the women in my books are individual, that they're not one size fits all, that the women interact with each other in ways that make sense for their characters, and it's not just, insta bond with my new gal pal. It's like it's friendships are all different, just the same as love affairs are all different. Friendships too are, can be complicated. They can be full of subcurrents. They can be toxic. They can be deeply beneficial, and they change over time as well. So I always try to make sure that I invest as much thought into making the friendships in my books impactful as I would in making the romantic relationships believable and impactful.
It shows. It shows in your writing. Were you ever tempted to write about a male historical figure?
Oh, I have to some degree. I mean, I've written male characters in a number of my books, male points of view. So it's not like I only write from women's eyes. I like writing from men's eyes as well. I have a number of my Rome books, especially, have a number of real uh, titanic male figures in them. Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, and who had the famous gay love affair with a Greek freedman named Antinous. There a number of my hero in those books is based off of a real historical figure who was a general under one of those. There's Emperor Domitian. There's the Year of Four Emperors, are all real men were trading the thrones like a merry-go-round. I wrote about the Borgia family, which has a number of, Cardinal Borgia and his sons, who are all, volatile, fascinating figures. And, a number of really interesting men in my World War II and World War I fiction as well. Captain Cameron, who was one of the spy masters in the Alice Network, was a real man who was really fascinating. He was very interesting life and set of influences. So I've written about a number of real men who I have found, great subjects for books. I do tend to gravitate a little bit more toward women because women's stories are so often more unseen and more unsung. And that's where I often tend to find some of the most fascinating stories, is in that area of history that's a little less plumbed.
And I'm so glad you do. I'm glad you tend to go that way because I enjoy it. And I think those are some important stories to be told. When you're writing your historical fiction, you know so much. I know the research is vital. And you've probably been asked this question many times, but I think it bears repeating. What kind of process do you follow? And how was your research different for magical realism than for historical fiction? And then I'm sure you know so much. How do you avoid just putting, I would want to, after I spend all that time, I'd want to put it all in the novel, but I know you don't. I know you go through and figure out what is your process with that.
Well, you start always with the historical deep dive because the historical facts and the historical record, that is going to be the bones of your story. You put that in place first, at like you're creating a skeleton, and then you layer the fictional elements on top of that once you have your foundation and your frame firmly in place. So that's always been the way that I work. But you always have to be aware when you are assembling this, your set of historical facts, your timeline, the events that you want to cover, the people you want to cover. You have to be aware that history is written by the winners. It is written by people who are biased and human and flawed. So you need to be aware of like where are the places that this history could be wrong. It's incorrectly recorded, or whether it's recorded with a conscious or unconscious bias by whoever is making sure that it survives to be told. You need to make sure that it's often going to be incomplete. You're not going to get a full set of facts. So you need to be aware of where those gaps are and where those things are, and be able to take that into account in how you're writing. But yeah, as soon as I have my facts in place, and I'm aware of where the gaps are, and I'll have to fill those with my own imagination and so forth. There is often the temptation you want to put it all in because generally you're researching and writing about something because you love it, and so you want the world to know everything that you found out in the course of your deep dive. But in the end, if it isn't serving the story, it has to go, and that often is something that your editor or your critique partners can help you find, where they can say like, look, I know how much that you spent 6 hours researching the building components of Hadrian's Wall, but nobody needs to know this much about concrete. And it is really slowing your story down. So the 14 pages on the building of Hadrian's Wall can really be 2 pages. And then that is where you throw a little tantrum in your head and so forth. But then you generally will come to the realization of like, okay, yeah, it's probably slowing things down. And then you have to trim and you have to see if you can pull stuff out if it is in fact slowing the story down. Because at the end of the day, I am writing a story that is supposed to entertain. I am not writing a nonfiction about the architecture of ancient Rome or the spies of World War I or whatever it is that I have gone down the deep rabbit hole researching.
I understand that historical fiction authors can end up on an FBI watch list. How does that happen?
It happens because every historical novelist I know, and really every novelist I know, has had to research something deeply troubling for a book. In fact, it's a great icebreaker with a set of novelists. Get us all in a room or around a table. What is the scariest, weirdest, most troubling thing you've ever had to look up, and that your internet search history now contains? And you'll get some eye openers. I mean, I have a friend who literally researched how to kill a small child and make it look like an accident.
Ooh.
I have a friend who researched how do you weaponize smallpox in a lab. I am certainly the person it was for the diamond eye. I was looking at because I was writing about a fictional presidential assassination attempt. I am the one who is looking at blueprints of the White House and trying to figure out where would the best angle of fire be if you were trying to shoot from the brush at someone who is standing on the south portico. And I'm researching this, and I'm just thinking, oh God, Homeland Security is going to be here any minute.
Banging on the door.
Yeah.
You mentioned your tropes earlier and said that found family is one of your tropes. What are some of the other tropes that you seem to put within most of your books?
I'm not sure all of them necessarily count as tropes, but there are a number of themes that I do tend to return to in my novels. And really that's not by choice. We can't choose the things that fascinate us. They just tend to come up in our work, whether we intend to put them there or not. So found family is one of mine. Female friendship. I am eternally fascinated by the ways in which women of the past find ways to carve out these little spheres of influence and independence in power when they live in eras that don't want them to have it, and how women of the past have found ways to contribute to huge important historical events even if their contributions are often sidelined. um, I am continually fascinated by war and its aftermath, and what how it affects people who are not only involved in fighting it, but the people around them who then have to live with it. And how do they live with it once the war is done? These are just a few of the things that I tend to keep coming back to. They tend to make their way in my books.
Well, before Susan and I talk some more about some of your other specific books you've written, would you please read a short segment from a book for us?
Yes, absolutely. I thought perhaps a passage from the Astral Library about something that I think every bibliophile loves, which is the smell of a book. Because I mean, raise your hand if you've ever opened a book and sniffed a fresh book and sniffed the pages. I have certainly done this. So this is the smell inside the Astral Library. And the book smell that was my favorite smell in the world, the smell that all libraries had, the smell that said home to me more than any home I'd ever actually had. Most people had a different set of smells that made them feel at home. Some mixture of mom's lasagna, the jasmine their dad planted at the front door, the floor wax their grandma always bought, the dog they'd had growing up. I'd lived in too many places as a child to associate any smell with safety and security, so I latched onto the smell of books instead. But the book smell in my local rundown branch libraries was usually overlaid more prosaically with roach killer or mold or the sweat of too many patrons in summer. This smell here, this ambrosia I was drinking in, was a pure library smell. Not just books, but everything good in the world that went with books. Old paper and beeswax and ancient polished wood, yes, but also the leathery smell of your favorite comfy reading chair, the delicious wafting aroma of the tea sitting at your elbow as you dove into your favorite book, the buttery deliciousness of the just baked chocolate chip cookie you crammed into your mouth as you turned the pages faster and faster, the smell of wood smoke because you were reading in front of a cozily crackling fire, the smell of lavender laundry soap from the lamb's wool blanket tucked around your knees, the smell of a cat because in a perfect library you'd have a cat purring at your feet as you read the best book in the world in front of a crackling fire with tea and chocolate chip cookies on the arm of your perfect reading chair. One delirious inhaled breath of that smell, the smell that somehow eased the perennial ache in my jaw and the throb in my temples, the smell that calmed my pulse, and I was gone. I didn't care if the books were moving and the clock didn't appear to be counting actual time. I took another hit of that smell and I never, ever wanted to leave.
Wonderful.
I don't want to
Wow.
leave either.
Oh,
Thank you. That's great. Great passage. Thank you so much. Oh, I was there. I didn't want to go. Let's talk about some of your specific historical fiction novels. Your entire career is impressive. But as I was reviewing your career, I was really struck by the fact that you wrote your first book, The Mistress of Rome, when you were a college freshman, around age of 18. Wow. Don't know what I was doing at 18, but it sure wasn't writing my first novel. Thea, the main character, is a slave girl who grapples with survival, independence, and happiness, and she's in the harsh realities of first century Rome. You once said, and I love this, you once said that the central theme of your novel is the value of endurance, that while most people can summon courage for a single act of bravery, it takes a much different kind of courage to withstand hardship or tragedy day after day after day. That's a remarkably insightful perspective for someone so young or at any age. Would you share more about how you explored this theme when you were writing?
Well, I think it was something I had lived to some degree, and it through a very different set of circumstances, of course, than the circumstances of anyone living in first century Rome. But we had in my family my father had cancer, and it eventually took him from us when I was about 12. But it did something remarkable the year that he was ill, was that it really forged my family, my parents and I, very close together, because we pulled together to get through it as a family. And I saw every day in that the kind of endurance it took on the part of my parents. And, I saw it on my own part too. It's like you just had to keep living with this situation day after day, with pain and with the obligation to bear up under that pain and to try to keep supporting your loved ones and to try to keep on. And there was no end in sight. You just had to keep going. And that was, that's a hard lesson to learn, but I don't think it was necessarily a bad lesson to learn. I think a lot of us are going to have to learn something like that at some point. And I'm sorry I had to learn it at that age, and I'm certainly sorry that for anyone who has cancer come into their family. But that was something that I did know, and I knew that from a young age, and I did want to explore that idea. And of course, at this time too, when I was 18, that was when I was meeting. Well, I met the man who was eventually now my husband, and he introduced me to his. He really loves sci-fi, and he has a collection of sci-fi short stories, an anthology that he loaned me that I read through and I really liked them. And his favorite one involves like I can't remember what it's called, and it involves though nuclear holocaust and like how the human race is going to survive. And there's a great phrase in that story, which he loves, called cellar courage. And it said, they talk about in that story about the kind of courage it takes to do what is necessary when no one is watching, when you're not going to get any applause, when you won't be rewarded for it, when maybe you won't even live to see if it works or not. That is a very different kind of courage than the sort of flashy, one spectacular act of bravery and you're done. And so I was reading this story around the same time, and I think that idea too of cellar courage also probably made its way to that book. Everything in a writer's life, is grist for the mill, and it might very well make its way into your work at some point, whether you intended it or not.
That's very cool. Well, speaking of grist, I understand you've got two companions that stay with you when you write, and I see them in the background there. Can you tell us a little bit about your buddies?
Yes, I have two rescue dogs. Caesar, who is my little black buddy over my shoulder here, is some kind of Schipperke mix. He's nearly 16 years old, and we've had him for 15 of those years. So he rules the house with an iron paw. And Molly, over there asleep in my writing chair, is a rescue beagle, and we adopted her last summer, and she has a truly impressive and historic ear span, which when the wind catches them, you think she's going to take flight.
Oh, that's
Well,
wonderful.
they're adorable. They're adorable. And I'm so glad that were willing to come with you on this interview with us in their home space. We mentioned Briar Club before. Jean was talking about what an amazing job you did with the characters. It's one of my favorite books. And I just have to say, it was one particularly insightful aspect was how you took the characters, and I think this reflects so much on when we meet people in life. When we first meet someone, or we only know them superficially, we form these initial impressions about them. But as we learn more about them and about the situations they go through, it often changes, and we realize that there's so much more to their identity and their motivations. And in Briar Club, I found that I made these assumptions about your characters, and then as you did the carousel that Jean mentioned, you learned so much more about them. And I think that just makes reading so important, those kinds of things that you're able to say, yes, this is in the book, but guess what, this is in life too. Don't you find that like such a wonderful thing in your writing? I mean, I know your writing is wonderful, but don't you find that an incredible thing to be able to do in your writing?
Well, it is the fun part, and certainly that was my intention in that book, was that it is you don't get to know each woman until the moment that the page turns and you realize, okay, this is her chapter. We're now in her head. And I did form it very likely. I wanted the reader to have, opinions about each of these women as you get to know them as side characters and other people's stories, but you're not going to know the full story until you get into their head. And that is exactly the way it is in real life. I mean, our neighbors, our friends, the people, who we cross paths with in daily life, they're just coming and going as side characters in our lives, but we really don't know what's going on in their lives unless they let us see behind that curtain. And that is true in life, and it is fascinating to me. And at least in a book, I can pull the curtain and I can show and I can get to know what is happening with everyone.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the Huntress. I think your use of the German translation, Die Jägerin, is so powerful. It gives a lot more haunting feeling to the story. And I know that title refers to Annalise Anna, but for me, the reader, I believe Nina is the pure huntress. Um, who's the huntress for you?
For me, I chose that title very deliberately because for me, all of the women are the huntress at different points. I mean, it refers specifically to the villainess, but Nina, as you would say, is the pure hunter. And even Jordan, though, by the end, has also joined the team and is also a huntress. So for me, that is a title that rotates, and it depends on who is doing the hunting at which point in the novel.
Well, it's very powerful. You cover so many facets of World War II and the aftermath. You start with the Russian women who were the pilots in these almost impossibly flimsy planes and the fierceness of them, but also the interaction of how they supported each other when they got very little support from the men in there. And the Nazis who tried to avoid persecution for their evil deeds and the relentless team that pursued them. Even when this is what disturbs me so much, how many people just wanted it all to disappear. Let's not talk about it. It's time to move on. And you were able to weave those all together, include all those elements, and help us feel why it was important not to just move on. Why, what within you made you give us that strength?
Well, it was the idea in that book of when does a number of themes that came up there, some of which are familiar ones. There's certainly found family and female friendships and those things, but it's also very much about justice. And it's about when does justice become revenge, and what is justifiable or legal in the pursuit of justice, and when does a line get crossed. It is about the nature of evil and why is it do people do evil things, and how much atonement is possible for what certain kinds of crimes, and is there a point at which you can legitimately ask that enough time has passed, how long do I need to still pay, and do people still have the right to continue to say yes, you should still pay. And so all of these are questions. I don't know that I answered all of them in the book. I mean, I certainly, it's one of the questions in there is like, people have asked me, why didn't you say more about why the villainess did the things she did? And I was just thinking, I'm not sure I said more about it, because that's the question about the nature of evil itself. Why do people do evil things? And there isn't an answer to that. Sometimes people just do terrible things because they did terrible things. They did them because they could get away with it. They did them because everyone else was doing it. And there's also part of me that says, in a way, I don't care why she did it. The fact is that she did it. And she does deserve to have justice meted out to her for that, regardless of what her reasons were. Like, at some point, does reason really matter? So these were all huge questions about the nature of evil and justice and retribution that I was, grappling with. And, you know, books help us ask questions, but we don't always answer them. Sometimes the question is still there at the end because it's a question that's so big, humanity is still grappling with it. I did feel like that when writing The Huntress.
Yeah, it leaves the reader asking, what do I believe in this? When do you give up? And that's why I think the book is so powerful, because it brings it forward but then leaves the reader the space to make decisions, which as a reader who doesn't.
I like to have things that will give people food for thought, even when
Right.
they're.
Another book you wrote about World War II is The Rose Code. I learned so much while reading this book. And there's also so much specificity about code breaking. How did you decipher all of this to get all this information and be able to give it to us about code breaking?
I did a lot of researching for that, and I went down a lot of rabbit holes. I read everything I could get my hands on about the code breaking process. There's still parts of it that are so complex, I do not understand them, and I nearly broke my brain writing this book, running up against that wall. The thing that saved me was that I realized somewhere in the middle of all this brain breaking and feeling like I was never going to understand it, is that I do not have to teach my readers how to be code breakers. I do not have to tell them how to break Obver Enigma. If they want to learn that, there are YouTube videos they can watch, and there are books they can read and articles that will break it down in very factual fashion, and they can go find those. What I am trying to do as a novelist is not teach the reader how to break Enigma. I am trying to teach the reader how does it feel to break Enigma. And so that's what I focused on, was how did my people feel when they were thrown into the deep end of this incredibly complex work, and how it changed their lives. And that's where I put my focus, so that I would not, in fact, go crazy trying to figure out how to break Enigma, which I still don't know how to do. I am not a natural code breaker.
You wove real people into this story. For example, Dilly Knox and Asla Benning, for example. Have you done that in other books, and why did you do it in this one?
I always like using a mix of real and fictional people. I quite often like having my main characters be fictionalized, or maybe sometimes fictional composites of real people, or sometimes they're real people about whom we know so little that I can make up what I need for my story without impinging on history. I would rather leave the real historic figures as point of view characters, because that way they enrich the narrative by being there, but they don't, I'm not necessarily trying to ascribe actions to them or thoughts that I'm not sure that they had. The one place where I have changed that was the closest to biographical historical fiction I've ever written is The Diamond Eye, which does have as its heroine and its main viewpoint character Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who was a real Soviet woman war heroine.
Um, Creating three women characters in this, one from very different, well, three different castes. You know, we talk about the caste system in India, but there's just that much caste system in England. So you have the society woman, you have the woman from East London, and then you have the autistic woman from a small community, a small town where everyone's living. Do you feel that this really represents the kinds of people who were at Bletchley Park?
Yes, Bletchley Park was truly a melting pot. You could have university graduates, rubbing elbows with, women who had never finished grammar school. You would have Duke's daughters rubbing elbows with, East End women. I mean, this was truly a melting pot. It was whoever could do the work, and, was and keep the secret. And I very much wanted as women who were very, very different, so that I could have that found family be as satisfying as possible if they truly come together from very, very different points in almost every way, so that there is the idea that this friendship truly would never have existed if Bletchley Park had not brought them together. They would never have even met in the ordinary course of life.
Um, isn't it amazing how, after so many decades, many of the people who signed the Secrets Act still have never revealed to their families what they did during the war?
Oh, they took that Secrets Act seriously, very much.
I read another novel about a woman. Well, it actually was informational about an Australian woman who had migrated to Australia. She never told her family. And when all this started coming out after 50 years, her grandson really just pushed her and pushed her until she revealed it. So even people who were married to each other didn't tell each other what they did during the war.
That's true. You had people where there were a number of Bletchley Park couples who only discovered after, in some cases, decades of marriage that they both worked at Bletchley Park.
It just amazing. That's why I said I just learned so much about Bletchley Park and what was going on and the National Secrets Act and all of that kind of thing. Just fascinating to me.
Kate, you are a Navy wife, so I have to say thank you for your service as an Army child, or an Army brat, as they say, and an Army wife myself. I recognize the major sacrifices that you and your family have had to make. The military services have gone a long way from when I was a little girl in recognizing the sacrifices that military spouses and their children make while a service member is deployed, or when they're moved around different duty stations all over the country, all over the world. Have you ever been tempted to write a novel depicting those sacrifices and duties that come along with being a military family?
I think I kind of already did. My last two novels in my Ancient Rome series follow a legionary who goes all over the world and all over the empire on various military campaigns, and his family, ends up coming along with him. So there's a lot in there that I was working my way through myself. My husband was deployed, ironically, to the same part of the world that my hero was at the time I was writing the book. And so there's quite a bit in there. It may be about an ancient Roman military family and military career, but it still had a lot of my husband's personality and also some of my own experiences as well. When you're just sort of being dragged around, after the Legion, or after the Legion in that case, after the ship, or the newest posting in our case.
Susan mentioned earlier that you wrote your first book that was published when you were 18. Did you start writing as a child? Is this something that you've wanted to do and now are hugely successful at doing?
I wrote my first short story when I was 7. I wrote my first novel when I was 10. It's just always something that I've done. At one point, I went to university to train for music. I was training to be an opera singer. My father was a classically trained musician and a professional jazz musician. I wanted to do that at one point, but I was always still writing books on the side. And if I was not, honestly, I would still be writing books whether I was publishing them or not. I would just be, if I was not published, I would just be putting books in drawers instead of sending them to my editor. But it's literally what I do for fun. It is my hobby. It's what I do.
Well, we have covered many topics and learned so very much. And my final question is, will you go back to writing historical fiction?
Yes, the next book is historical fiction. It's about the suffragette movement in the UK as the women were battling for the right to vote. So, yes.
Wonderful. We will definitely, do you have a title yet?
No, I really don't. I had one that was a working title, and it looks like it's going to be changed for something else, but we're not sure what yet.
Okay. Well, thank you so very much for sharing this time with us. I know that our OLLI audience will love it, and we'll be putting it out for YouTube so it will go wild. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Kate. Really
No,
wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.